My name is Colin Creed. I have been involved in tattooing since 1975. I've been retired for a good portion. I've come back in the last 5 years to turn around and build machines. That's my involvement in tattooing these days. Mentoring a few artists and bits and pieces like that. I started tattooing in the mid-70s. By 1979, I started working professionally. Those times were very different. The American market or the American suppliers hadn't appeared to the Australian market to a large degree. As an Australian tattooist, you pretty much had to build a lot of your own equipment. There were Australian suppliers, but unless you worked professionally, you never got a chance to get anything from them. That meant that you literally had to turn around and kind of build almost everything yourself. My background being a jeweller meant that I had the abilities to be able to turn around and work metal. I also had a bit of an idea. My father's background was electronics and kind of whatnot, so I was able to pick his brain a little bit on some of the electrical elements that I was not sure about. As a tattooist, you always come into this game with the elements that your trade or what you came from, and you bring that in, and then you build on the information that you learn from that. Mine being jewellery, I was able to turn around and kind of build the machines, and in doing so I still build machines today, but I do them a lot different. The machine that I built here was the particular style that I always built. It's my preferred one that I like. Unfortunately, it's just so time consuming to build them, but it was one of those options that I decided to turn around and build this one as the last one and document it in the process. I start with steel strap. Prefer to work with the steel. It's got the strength. Again, I build machines in this style and this way for a particular reason. It's because I'm emulating that old school technique of that in most cases in the old days you either had access to oxyacetylene, so as such you were used to doing steel. Fusion welding, and I then also add to that by doing brazing. So with those skill sets, with that kind of equipment, part of the idea was that simple hacksaw, simple vise, simple files, basic equipment that you can then turn around and build yourself a tattoo machine from. That's pretty much what I'm trying to emulate here. This particular style was an easy way to kind of build them. You could just use steel strap, and it was literally a case of heating and bending and cutting and filing. That's pretty much what I'm building here, and that's what you will see is the process of, obviously I perfected my own style of machine that's based on this particular look. These style of machines, what's now referred to as a bulldog, and as such I refer to him as a Hugo because I had an Aussie bulldog and his name was called Hugo. This particular style is well known. Now, kind of Sailor Jerry had a kind of style. I've seen machines like his. Some of the American suppliers have got a similar looking type of frame. There's nothing unusual about it. It's just the kind of construction or the way you go about it that can be a little bit different. And in my case, this is how I did them, because in effect you were building them in your garage at home and with the minimal amount of tools, and that's what I continued to do and emulate with this particular build. In this I do fusion welding. I like to be able to turn around and kind of like cut and file to create any bends. I think it produces a tighter and neater seam where the bend point is. Some people will just put the strap into a vise and literally just bend it, and that's fine. That's how it works for them. Having the jewellery background, I'm used to different thicknesses. So in this particular case, I actually cut a recess and bend, so I get a nice clean bend, and then fusion weld so that it's steel on steel. And that just gives a stronger weld point, which will then be filled later on in with brazing. Because they are so time consuming, they're not something that I'm keen on doing on a regular basis. And I'm not getting any younger and my eyes aren't where they used to be, so with that, that's why this is the last of this particular type of machine build. It was probably a prime reason to turn around and kind of show how I do them. With this, obviously there's mark out, cutting, filing, drilling. It's all simple, straightforward metalworking elements. And that's exactly how it was done. Simple tools, simple bits. In this case, I'll work between a grinder and a file. The grinder in question is a linishing machine or a linisher, and so I'll use coarse belts so they'll remove material quickly. They'll remove the roughness, and then I'll finesse with the file. Here's the main elements or components of the frame. The quick change section for holding the tube, the main body of the frame, and the side arm. I try to build the frame in sub-assemblies. So the first element that goes on is the quick change. What you're seeing is the creation of the side arm. I build it as a totally separate element, and that allows me to turn around and kind of make it square, check all the dimensions. That allows me to then fit up a side arm. And it also allows me then to turn around and position it on the frame where I want it. In some cases, the side arm, its position in relation to the frame and its position in relation to the tube can make a machine run very different, almost like you're creating two separate machines. So for the repeatability, I always build it separately, and that way then I can do fine adjustments and get it very close, weld it into place, and then do extra adjustments if I need to. Hence why I use heat. Sometimes force is necessary, and sometimes finesse is a better option. In this particular case, I tend to finesse things. With all the steel points and all the voids cleaned, I now apply a flux. I like that because it allows me to get into corners easier, and then I do the brazing. My measurements effectively have come down from other machines. When you've owned a number of machines over a certain amount of years, there's a lot of elements that you will find. A machine or a particular style of machine might work really well for a particular purpose, and in doing so, you then turn around and kind of use those old machines as your reference point. You'll take measurements, you'll work it out. This particular hole is going to be for the stud that will hold, or the clamp that will form the quick change, and the quick change is what holds the tube in place. With drilling, especially once you've started to get into kind of more thicknesses, it's always a help to turn around and lubricate while you're drilling. In this case, a little bit of oil just to turn around and kind of help the drill cut through. Sometimes it can even be as simple as that you started out life with your handmade machine. In the process of that, you've realised you've made a piece of crap, and you then worked out what some of the problems were. You know, you might close up certain gaps, or you might go, oh, that needs to be a bit shorter than that, and or you might start to buy certain coils from a certain supplier and find out that they didn't fit another supplier's frame. I'll have to make my own frame that does allow for these particular coils. And in so doing, you then start to create your own measurement. Next is testing all your threads, making sure the screws all go in correctly. Here's the final frame from where it started from. The next stage is assembly, but the frame, in between assembling and the finishing of the frame itself, the frame went off to a process called black oxide. It's not a process that I can do in-house. I have a place to do that, commercial process. When it returns, I now start the assembly. With the coils, they've got a coating on the wire that needs to be removed where you're going to solder them to lugs or whatever the case may be. You have a top and you have a bottom coil. I've already established which one is which. I've set up my wires. With that, it's just a case of scraping the shellac covering that's on the wire, the protective coating. You need to remove that off the pigtails so that you can solder them together. Because I'm building these machines how I used to build them in the old days, I've chosen to turn around and kind of use the old suppliers that I was using in the old days. The reality is, yes, I can hand make my own coils, but I can't get the power and the quality of punch out of handmade coils that I can from these particular ones. The supplier still makes the same coils in the same way and the same type of coils as what they were doing 30 years ago. It's the same quality as though I was making them, all that time ago. This particular customer wanted this machine to have a dual connection, which in this case is clip cord and an RCA. In doing so, I've had to create a bracket and work out all the elements that need to go in. Given that this is a hand-built machine, I haven't got any templates for some of those bits that I'd be adding. This is the parts where I trial and error and make sure everything fits together, and checking for alignments, making sure it all sits in the right place and doesn't have an interference fit on something else when you go to put it together. The assembly of the coils, with that it's the soldering of the pigtails. Obviously the pigtail sections need to have insulation tubing attached to them. Obviously they'll have certain lengths to fit the frame. I've got some templates that I've made. Sometimes it's a case of you trial it up against the length and work it out. Capacitor, wires coming off the capacitor aren't long enough to reach back to the point where they need to attach. In that case, what I do is I'll make it like an extension. Extension piece that gets soldered onto the existing capacitor wire that gives me a little bit of a length. Think of it as like an extension cord. With the coils now positioned, I can do the last fitments, the electrical connections. With that, then I can start to finish out the build by putting in the binding posts and all the rest of it. The bottom binding post is already positioned. That's where the clip cord goes into. The top one is where that provides the power, the contact to the spring. Once I've got the top binding post in place, I like to try and make sure that all of the wires, the pigtail wires, are all nicely positioned, and make sure they're not going to foul on the armature bar, which still needs to be fitted. I like the wiring to hug the frame as tightly as I possibly can. I don't like having it hanging out in mid-air where it constantly gets caught on bits and pieces. The less obstacles you've got, the less chances are you either catch it on your gloves when you're working with the machine, or it gets caught on a wire or clothing or something. I like a clean, functional, tidy machine without any extra bits of crap hanging off it. With the top binding post positioned, I like to fit a tube blank into the machine and gun barrel it down the sight of the tube to double check contact screw is aligned centrally to the tube. The contact screw isn't in alignment with the center line of the tube. The idea is that I use shimming washers that are part of the insulators to space it in or out to get that correct alignment. Fitting of the armature obviously involves attaching springs. I hand make my own springs, my own specific way of cutting them. What I always find that I need to do is I need to fine tune them into fitting correctly. I don't use any jigs, I just use a pair of pliers, or a specific pair of pliers that allow me to turn around and lock the springs together while I do up the armature. Having put the springs now onto the armature bar, next stage is to put tension into the springs themselves. I like a nice smooth flowing bend in the springs. Get a kink in them in any way, shape or form, I've always found that's the point they'll crack on. It takes a little bit of tweaking. I also use a spring gauge. I've got a preset that I like, or I make sure the spring gauge works up to. It was nice to build this, but by the same token, it was also a very quick reminder of how long they take. While I enjoyed the building process, I'm also glad to see the end of this particular machine. They're not something that I'd want to be building every time I had to make a machine. But having said that, it was a nice reminder. Yeah, I appreciate just how much I prefer building my new machines with their process than having to turn around and do all of the machines this particular way.